thanks everyone for coming to the session today. We are going to talk about a heated topic, emerging. That's about energy transition, and it's about energy transitioning into the renewable energy like solar, wind, that needs to happen, better still happens, but also they are going to take a lot of lands, and as we heard in the plenary talk yesterday, sometimes the amount of lands may or may not add up, so some careful planning is needed at every corner of the world, across scales at community level, regional level, national level. But before I get into the specific talks, I should probably introduce myself first. I'm Siyu. I'm a postdoc at the Nature Conservancy. And this session is co-organized by me and Ash, who's another postdoc also working at the Nature Conservancy, and Paola, who's a postdoc based in University of Oslo and worked more on the renewable energy transition for many years. And within our team, we work on integrating community voices and social values into not just the renewable energy development, but also conservation development, and generally all the development around the land systems as a whole. And today we are very lucky to put together a session with 3 talks, actually 4 talks, we'll see, from all over the world. Ash will talk about national level planning work from India. I'll let you get more into that. I think Jonas from ETH, you probably have more affiliations you're covering your slides. And he will be talking about also renewable energy planning, multi-criteria prioritization work in the Alps. And we are also honored to have Enoch and, and Juana. Yes, they are actually from Oaxaca, and they were volunteer researchers in Paola's research project that are looking at community level approaches related to wind energy development in Oaxaca. So I will pass mic to Ash.
Okay, hi everyone, can you hear me? Okay. All right, so I'm just going to start by apologizing. My brain is a little mixed up this morning, so I'm going to do my best to do justice to the work that my team has been working on. I'm going to be presenting one of our projects, some of the efforts that our team has been making around the world, and in this case in India. And then, yeah, okay, so my name is Aishwarya Bhattacharjee, as Siyu already introduced me. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. We're based with the Protect Lands, Oceans, and Water unit. A lot of our work revolves around protecting lands, whether that be for the benefit of nature as well as the benefit of people. And my work, particularly within this postdoc project, has been how to integrate people's well-being, people's priorities into some of the planning work that we do. And what I'm presenting today while I'm here is a much larger body of work that's been done by several people who are co-authors on this paper and on this presentation and the paper, 2 papers that are coming out of it, and specifically 2 people on our team, Jim and Joe, as well as several co-authors from our collaborative organization in India that I'll talk about a little bit later. So I don't have too much time, so for the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip the introduction on like how our team goes about like our broader spatial planning work with renewable energy. I'll just very quickly point out that the work I'm talking about today falls under the values mapping, values and indicators, social or environmental values and indicators. This covers a wide range of potential data sets that we try to leverage. And so that's just a quick and dirty mention of that. I also won't go into the bottom-up, top-down approaches that are really important to consider. These are all really important considerations. Happy to talk about them either after the session or one-on-one. But I will say that the work we're talking about today falls under what we call the coarse filter, like taking this ecological concept of coarse filter, fine filter. What we're talking about is using secondary data that's at a coarser scale and leveraging that. And so that would fall under the coarse filter approach. So as Siyu sort of already touched on, many regions, many countries in the world are ramping up their renewable energy targets, their work towards putting in renewable energy to tackle climate change, to deal with this growing demand for energy, both with population growth as well as the need to kind of transition away from fossil fuel use and dependence on fossil fuels. And while this work is really important, we really underline that planning and implementation must proactively take measures to avoid and minimize the conflicts, the latent and underlying social conflicts that we know are undoubtedly going to crop up. Given this large, we're projected that there's a large land area that's needed for a lot of this development, particularly solar, and there are other conflicts associated with other types of development. And so this land use change that's expected to occur, or even land cover, is undoubtedly going to impact local communities. And so our team understands, or we're really put a lot of focus on trying to implement whatever strategies or use whatever data we can to incorporate this into the spatial planning work that we do to support either local governments, local organizations, or TNC's local chapters in different parts of the world. And in India, what we're doing is we're trying to, within this social dimension, we're trying to look at people's dependence on land and how we might be able to measure that. And so one of the social data sets that we've been developing in our team has been trying to characterize people's dependence on land using government census data. So I think a couple of talks actually at this conference have already talked about the census data, including at the plenary. There's a lot of information there, and so we've just relied on some components, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And the point is to measure dependence or potential vulnerability. And it's been integrated into a decision support tool that we have, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but that's just how we've used it so far. And that tool is called the SiteRight web tool. So just to kind of lay the groundwork for what the context of this work. In India, we know that one of the papers from our team in a collaboration with Microsoft used satellite imagery to see where existing infrastructure is going in. And they found that with a very quick overlap, they found that about 68% of existing solar projects in India have been developed on sites that are agricultural lands, and 7% was on natural ecosystems. And so we know that if projects are poorly sited, we expect that there will be conflicts and there will be consequences for local communities as well as our biodiversity priorities in the region. And so these potential impacts to biodiversity, community livelihood, and importantly, food security, those implications are pretty grave if this work is not planned responsibly. And so the SiteRight tool that I mentioned is something that the Nature Conservancy India as well as Protect have worked hard on to kind of make this tool available to many different stakeholders in India, primarily government officials, renewable energy, Ministry of Renewable Energy officials, as well as state governments and local community organizations that are working in this space. The tool is already online, so if people have interest in this, you're welcome to go and check it out. It's only available for 9 states, but these are the 9 states that we expect about 80% of development for renewable energy is going to occur there. And we do actually have data for other states, and at the moment we're working on expanding the tool. But the tool has 3 modules. So there's an awareness module, there's a siting. So the awareness module looks at extent. You can get extent information about constraints to development, about development potential. The siting module has, it ranks land parcels based on suitability that our team has worked on. But then the assessment module is what I'm talking about today, because that's where the social data set is housed. And this is essentially, users can go into the tool, put in a polygon that they have or draw a boundary, and it spits out a very quick assessment of a summary of environmental elements and social elements. And the social data that's in there is what I'm talking about today. And on the right is just a screenshot of a report that presents this siting tool. This is a product of a collaboration between TNC India and 3 of our very close organized local NGOs. That includes Vasudha Foundation, C-STEP, and the Foundation for Ecological Security. Particularly that last one is who we're working very closely with on this work. So Before I go into the indicators, just a background on the dimension that's captured in this data set is that there's a common lands focus. So in addition to the fact that FES, Foundation for Ecological Security, they focus on common lands are really important in the context, particularly in India. So these are lands that can be community pastures, community forests, unculturable land, and land that's often misclassified as wastelands. But essentially, these lands are collectively used, managed by local communities, but often under the jurisdiction of the government. They may be owned by governments or informally owned. Importantly, this makes up about a quarter of the country's land area, and significant populations, particularly rural populations, are dependent on them. So an estimated 350 million people use these lands to meet their subsistence and livelihood needs in a variety of ways. And I'll also underline here that sometimes these lands are the first to be given up by the government, as the way it works in India is when the government is pointing to land parcels for developers to use. Because of the jurisdiction and the somewhat lack of security in land tenure, these are often the lands that are first to be given up. And so that's a big part of why we started focusing in on this land class. So the decision on which indicators to use from the census data and how to go about thinking about how we measure people's dependence on land was primarily led by our collaborators at FES. And they've developed a framework that we're currently trying to publish that's on social value. So how do we characterize social value within this context? And they've basically developed this framework that hypothesizes, or the rationale behind this hypothesis is that people's dependence on land, specifically common land, and its potential, and it's a proxy for potential vulnerability, is greater in the areas that are characterized by one or more of the following four groups. So the first is when commons or forests are the predominant form of land use or land cover. The second is when livelihoods are heavily land-based, such as agricultural characteristics, natural or rain-fed irrigation is the predominant use of agriculture, or high livestock holdings. The third is when historically disadvantaged peoples, two groups in particular, make up a considerable portion of a given land area. And then finally, when an area is particularly remote in the context of distance to social resources, like administrative centers or local agricultural markets. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go too into the details on how the construction of the data set. They are 12 indicators that were pulled out from the Census of India, and then we did calculations to produce the type of indicators that we were interested in. They range from both categorical to numerical, but this is open access data, so it came from the Government of India's Census of India website. This is pretty old data, but this is actually the last census that's been published for India. Ideally, a new census will come out soon, but that's not clear on when that's going to happen. And then some of the information also comes from the Department of Agriculture, so India's Department of Agriculture's farmer portal. So that's the livestock holding information and information on rain-fed agriculture. So the data was appropriately transformed, normalized, scaled. All the indicators are from a 0 to 1 scale, and we've also formatted them in a spatial format, so they're aggregated to the village level. And so this is just a look. So we have the 12 indicators that I've listed here. I can go through them, although I don't know, Siyu, if you're taking the time. But the 12 indicators we have, I can go through them, first is common land. So that's in a given village land area, the proportion that it's common land. The second is forest lands. The third is livestock holding per household. It's a bit small, so I'm going to go through all of them. The fourth is dependence on firewood or fuel wood for cooking. So these are when households reported that their primary fuel for cooking was firewood, so the collection of firewood. The fifth is proportion of unirrigated or naturally irrigated land. The sixth is when people used non-timber forest products as their primary use of construction material. The seventh and the eighth fall under the vulnerable populations. So scheduled caste and scheduled tribe populations are government-designated classifications of populations that have been historically marginalized in India. And so the proportion of those communities that exist within a village's area. The ninth is availability of markets, and 10th is availability of roads, so cemented roads. These are both access-based indicators. 11 is distance to a sub-district headquarter, and then the last is whether households were dependent on water resources from common lands as their primary source of drinking water. In this image in the middle is just the aggregation of all these indicators together. We actually don't, I'm going to talk a little bit about this on the next slide. We don't use this aggregated indicator because they are correlated, of course, some of these indicators, but we just wanted to show nationally, if we were to look at these patterns, what does that look like at a very large scale? And so what I was saying earlier, this is a simple correlation analysis just to show that across these 12 indicators, there are moderate correlations between some of them. We don't expect, so if in the aggregated index I showed earlier, each of them is weighed equally. It's an additive index. And it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to start weighing that at a national scale. In fact, we suggest or we recommend that this data set is used as needed or as for the purposes of the question, whether it's a development question or a conservation question, and also within the local context. So for a given village in India, some of these indicators may be more important than others, and also for the type of energy development as well. So yeah, I'll say that, and I will show how this is currently integrated into our spatial tool. So if you were to go into the assessment module and you put in, I've put in a dummy project area that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's just to show how we're kind of offering this to practitioners and stakeholders that are interested and how TNC is approaching this. So in this dummy project area, for a given area, it spits out, and I don't have the environmental assessment up here, but the social assessment will give you some sort of a measure for potential social conflict, but I'll just underline that that's considering all the indicators, it's spitting out a score. So from 0 to 100, just 0 to 1 being converted to that. But what you can see here is that certain indicators will be higher than others for the area that you're interested in. And it's meant to be sort of like a guidance tool or a decision making. I wouldn't say decision making, but a decision support tool that either practitioners, conservation practitioners, developers, or government officials can use this if there's a parcel that they're interested in, compare areas, or figure out what social impact assessments are necessary, because they're not always required based on the government's requirements. And so beyond the way it's integrated into the tool, the data set, this is some very preliminary analysis of how we're looking at the data set and how we might be interested in seeing spatial patterns of social sensitivities around existing infrastructure. So on the left, I have locations of solar plants in India from 2018 to 2022. That's a product of a collaboration between Microsoft, Planet, and the Nature Conservancy to both plot existing infrastructure and predict where infrastructure might be going, renewable energy infrastructure. So on the left is solar, existing solar. It's over 1,300 sites. And in the middle, I took a subset of the 12 indicators based on their underlying variance explained and their relationships. And I have a very flat breakup into low, medium, and high. But essentially, we're just looking at sensitivity. So I looked at an overlap. What's the degree of, around a given buffer for solar and for wind, what's the degree of high sensitivity for each of these indicators? So I just give an example of firewood sensitivity here, just to show, India itself has a lot of land inherently that is important for firewood dependence. But it also happens to be that a lot of the development for solar has happened in those lands. And the same for wind. So we have information on wind infrastructure, and within a buffer of that, the degree of overlap with certain social indicators. And I'll point out that the same social indicators for solar and wind showed up twice. Of course, the mismatch in time, and as well as the fact that the data is quite old for the social indicators, is something we highlight, we underline it. I think what it represents in and of itself is that this is where infrastructure has been developed, what the social sensitivities were during that point of time. Some of these indicators are also more plastic than others. We know that firewood dependence, for example, has probably changed significantly since 2011, but that may not be true for where tribal populations exist in India, just based on the way that happens. So that's something, it's a huge caveat, and obviously we know that, but this is also the data that we have available. What we are trying to do separately from this is cross-validate this data with more recent global data sets or regional data sets that serve as proxies for some of these indicators, such as the Global Human Modification Index, the Global Relative Poverty Index, and some regional, like India-specific land cover and land use data sets. And so with that, I'll just end by saying that, we look at this data set as something that might be useful for conservation practitioners, government officials, local conservation orgs, and researchers who are interested in this dimension that's often underrepresented in some of the spatial planning work that ends up happening within renewable energy siting. So with that, I end, and thank you for your attention.
Sorry, questions?
Thanks very much. This is a very interesting initiative from TNC, I think. We should talk. My question relates to how do you define or decide which of the variables to use? Did you do interviews previously to understand these social values? Thanks.
It's a major point that I just totally skipped in my presentation, I'm sorry, and it's something that I do talk about on the slide deck. FES, the Foundation for Ecological Security, conducted many, I don't know exactly how many, I'd have to look at the methods that I wrote up, but they've done focus group discussions as well as they did like one-on-one interviews with experts that they selected for expert feedback, but most of it was focus group discussions. They used that information as well as secondary literature to then come up with that framework that I mentioned and then figure out which indicators or which census information could fit into those indicators. So that's how it happened. And that's the paper that I mentioned, is that we're writing up the framework and how we came up with the indicators that end up being used in the spatial data set. Yeah, sorry, that's an important point and I missed it.
I also have more like a comment. In the last two slides really nicely showed these locations of wind power and solar power. But what about the power lines to get the electricity supply, right?
Yeah.
How would that influence the results? Have you thought about including this?
So transmission data is taken into account for the predictions of where solar went, but I didn't use predicted solar or wind. I used existing solar and wind. But the Global Renewables Watch data that I cited, they do use transmission data. I don't know if it's actually on their page. Like if you were to go on their website, it's because it's technically open access, though I don't think the most recent data is up there. I don't know if they make that data. In India, for example, I don't think that data is open access. I may be wrong, but I don't think it is. But it's a good question. And so that's why I kind of limited this to where infrastructure already exists. Yeah. But yeah. I think there was one more. Do we have time? Yeah.
Just one clarifying question before I ask my question.
Yeah.
When you used the census data from the NSSO, did you get the village level data, or did you get down to the household level data and then aggregate back up to the village?
We used the household data and aggregated back up to the village level.
Okay. So one interesting thing potentially, and wondering if you had looked at it all, was the intra-village variability in a lot of these indicators, and so whether or not there's a lot of variability or a little bit of variability in terms of thinking about social vulnerability.
Yeah.
And the only thing I'd say is you're already working with C-STEP, so I think they have the Safari model that might do some of the future land use, solar land use stuff, if I remember correctly.
So I'm not that, I've worked more closely with FES than C-STEP. I think they were more involved in like the other modules of the tool, but if you are interested, we can talk later, and I think Joe, my boss, he's been working on this project for a lot longer than I have, like all the stuff that came before it and how they decided on like the methodology. That's something that I think Joe would be better like to respond to some of that. But yes, the intravariability between villages is important. I actually want to look at that for the paper, but one of the issues with this data set is the village boundaries and the mismatch between village boundaries we have access to. So I'm figuring out how to do that. One of the ways I'm doing it is doing like random sampling as just points to avoid having to match it to a village. But if we can talk later, maybe we can talk more about this and you might have some ideas. Yeah.
Hola, buenos días a todas y a
good
todos.
morning, everyone.
Nosotros somos Areli Romo y Enoc López.
We are Areli
somos
and Romo.
originarios de Juchitán de Zaragoza, Oaxaca.
We come from Oaxaca,
en la región del Istmo de Tehuantepec.
in the region Istmo de Tehuantepec.
Es la primera vez que estamos
It's the
aquí y
first time we're
estamos
here.
muy emocionados
We're very
por
excited
compartir
for
con
sharing
ustedes los resultados
with
de
you
la
the
investigación
results
en la
of
que
this
tuvimos
research
la
that we
oportunidad de
participated
participar en 2018
in 2018.
gracias a la invitación de la
Thanks to
doctora
the
Paola
invitation
Velasco-Herrejon,
of Paola
quien es la
Velasco,
autora principal de
which
esta,
is the
de
main
esta
author
presentación,
of this
de esta
research.
investigación. Esta investigación
This
se basó
research was based
en un enfoque de capacidades para evaluar
approach
el impacto en el bienestar de las personas derivado
respecting
de la
the
instalación
well-being of people
de la infraestructura
for
eólica
installation
que se
of
encuentra
wind
instalada en la región
infrastructure
del Istmo de
in this
Tehuantepec.
region, Istmo de Tehuantepec.
Los objetivos de la
The
investigación
objectives of
fue
the research
analizar los
was to
impactos en el
analyze the
bienestar de
impacts
tres
of the well-being
comunidades
of
de la
three
región del Istmo,
indigenous communities.
comunidades indígenas que están cercanas
They are
a los parques
Close
eólicos.
to the farms, to the wind farms,
Comprender la relación entre la
to
aceptación
understand the
comunitaria y
relationship
el éxito
between
de
the
estos
community
proyectos de energía
acceptance and the
eólica.
success of these projects.
Identificar las capacidades y
And to
valores
identify
que
the
estas comunidades
capabilities
consideran
and values that
esenciales para su
the communities
bienestar.
consider essential for their well-being.
El marco conceptual que se utilizó
The
fue el
framework that we
enfoque
used
basado
was
en
an
capacidades,
approach based on
que
capabilities
incluye lo que es
that include
las capacidades, que son
the
las
capabilities
oportunidades
themselves,
reales y libertades que tienen las
the
comunidades,
real capabilities that they consider they have,
los funcionamientos,
the
los logros
functionalities,
tangibles que
the
son para ellos los
they
más
consider
importantes,
the most important ones,
la participación comunitaria,
the
la
community participation,
importancia de escuchar las aspiraciones que
the
tienen las
importance of
personas
hearing the aspirations and the desires they have,
y el contexto y valores culturales,
and the
no
context
solo
and
en lo
cultural
económico.
values, not only in the economical aspect.
La metodología que se utilizó
The
fue un
methods
enfoque
we
de
used
participación mixta.
Was mixed participatory approach.
Aquí lo importante que queremos resaltar es que se involucró a la comunidad
is that we involved the community
desde el diseño, la
since the
implementación
design, implementation,
y el análisis de los datos que se recabaron durante la investigación.
and to analyze the data that we collected.
Fueron tres fases.
There were three phases.
La primera fase fue la fase cualitativa,
The first one is the qualitative.
donde se realizaron entrevistas y focus group
We conducted
a diversas personas en las tres
Focus
comunidades.
group and surveys in the three communities.
La segunda fase fue la
The
fase
second
cualitativa,
one was quantitative.
donde se realizaron entre encuestas a adultos de
Surveys
estas
to
tres
adults
comunidades.
in the communities.
Y la tercera fase fue la
And the third
fase
one,
participativa,
Participatory phase.
donde se realizaron talleres participativos para pues hacer una
We
retroalimentación
conducted
y analizar
group workshops
y corroborar
for feedback.
los hallazgos que se encontraron durante las anteriores fases.
For feedback for the findings of the previous phases.
Tuvimos la oportunidad de hablar con
We had the
450
opportunity to
personas
talk
de esas
with
tres
over
comunidades.
100 people in the communities.
El contexto de las comunidades.
The context
Estas comunidades
These
se encuentran en Oaxaca,
are
México,
found in Oaxaca,
específicamente en la región del Istmo de
in the region
Tehuantepec.
called Istmo.
Las tres comunidades son
The
El
three of
Espinal,
them are
Unión Hidalgo y Santo
Those are
Domingo
the names.
Ingenio. Estas comunidades forman parte del corredor eólico
belong
del Istmo de
to
Tehuantepec,
the corridor, the wind corridor in the Istmo
que alberga 32 parques eólicos instalados
that has 32 farms, wind farms installed already,
en 32,000 hectáreas que son arrendadas a 14 empresas.
in 32,000 hectares that are given to enterprises.
Las características socioeconómicas y culturales de estas
The
comunidades
main features for these communities,
son que hay una alta población
there's high
que se
population
autodenomina comunidad indígena,
that are themselves denominated or called indigenous, they recognize themselves.
Los niveles de pobreza en estas comunidades son
Poverty levels
significativos
are significant.
y hay un fuerte arraigo a la identidad cultural, cohesión social y valores
Culturally rooted
comunitarios.
in these communities.
Los resultados de
The results
las prioridades de bienestar que existen en las comunidades
about the
identifican
wellness
principalmente
priorities.
la salud y las relaciones familiares.
They are mainly health and family relationships.
Esto como las capacidades más valoradas
The
para
capabilities
las
more
comunidades.
valuated for
Seguido de
them.
esto, la educación
After this was education.
y el empleo son dos de las
Employment
siguientes capacidades valoradas por ellas.
are the
Sin
next
embargo, cada una
capabilities
de estas
identified.
tiene
Nevertheless,
diferentes percepciones dependiendo de las
each one of
comunidades.
these has different perceptions.
Por ejemplo, el
according
espinal
to
ve la
each
educación
community.
como una
For
oportunidad de
example,
empleo para las futuras
educational
generaciones.
and
En el caso
employment
de Santo Domingo
was
Ingenio,
different.
ven
In the case of one
el tema de
community,
educación como un
education
método de defensa
was like a
contra
defense
la
method.
manipulación del gobierno.
Against government manipulation.
Dentro de los resultados
As part
de
of the
esta investigación,
results of this
se puede
research,
entender que
we
solamente
can
una
find that
tercera parte de la
just
población
1/3 of
es
this
beneficiada
population
directamente por los proyectos
is
eólicos.
considered
Es decir,
directly
solamente
from the
una
wind
tercera parte
projects.
recibe
That means that only
beneficios
1/3
por
of
el
this
arrendamiento de
population
sus tierras.
receives the benefits of these
Existe
enterprises.
una desigualdad, las
If
personas
there's
tienen
inequality
una
and they
percepción de
perceive-
desigualdad
they perceive
debido a
this
que no todos se
inequality
ven beneficiados
because not everyone
y
is
se enfatiza
benefited.
principalmente, las comunidades enfatizan en que los
They insist,
beneficios
the
que se reciben
communities, that these
a través
benefits
de la industria eólica debería
through
ser
the
de
wind
manera general y
industry
debería
should
ser
be
aportada para todos.
generalized. The well-beings should be for everyone.
En temas de empleabilidad,
In
cuando
terms
las
of-
empresas llegan con la intención de arrendar tierras en el istmo de Tehuantepec,
Sometimes the enterprises
siempre
want
llegan con
to
el
rent the
mensaje de
land,
que van a haber
and they give
empleos
the message
para
that
todas las personas
everyone is
que
going to get
habitan en las
employment for
comunidades.
the population.
Sin embargo, la realidad es totalmente
However,
diferente.
the reality is
La
different.
realidad es que
At the
solamente
end,
existen empleos
There are
diversos y
employments,
en grandes
diverse
cantidades durante la
employments
fase de
and
construcción.
opportunities
Y
during the
solamente,
construction phase.
el 3.4% de estos
Only
empleos se vuelven de manera se vuelven
3.4%
fijos
of these employments
y de manera estable
still
cuando los
exist
proyectos
after
entran
the
en una
construction
fase de
phase.
operación y de mantenimiento.
For
Y
the
debido a esto, las comunidades han
maintenance
presentado
phase,
cierta resistencia,
so
cierta
they
oposición,
they represent,
debido a que
a
pues, las
resistant
expectativas de empleo no se cumplen como fueron prometidas.
idea because they disagree with the employment inequality.
La instalación de estos proyectos ha generado, además de esta
This
diferencia
project have
de
generated,
desempleo,
aside
un tema
from
de
the
inseguridad
differences in terms
derivado
of
de
safety,
que solamente algunas personas han sido beneficiadas
just some
por
of them are
el
benefited.
arrendamiento de sus tierras.
They-
También se derivan problemas de alcoholismo,
There
drogadicción,
are like social
violencia
problems,
e
like
inseguridad.
alcohol problems in the families, and they think that enterprises have caused part of these problems.
Existe un impacto negativo también en
There's
la
a
cohesión
negative impact in
social
terms of the
derivado que
social
las
aspect.
comunidades sienten y resienten
feel
el hecho de
that,
que personas de otras localidades
people
lleguen a
from other
habitar
communities
sus comunidades y pierdan el control de la forma en la que se
Like
desarrollan
get
ellos.
to their communities and they have no control for their own land.
Otro de los puntos importantes
Another
es que
important aspect is
las
that
comunidades sienten
communities, they feel
que
that
hace falta transparencia en
there's
los
lack of
recursos
transparency
que
from
sobre todo la
resources, especially
municipalidad
the
recibe
municipalities,
derivado de los
the money they get
derechos
from
de uso de
the
suelo, de los
rights
cambios
of
de uso de
land,
suelo que se dan
the
en
change of land use
en las comunidades
in the communities,
y también el pago de los impuestos.
and also the payment
Sin embargo, existen
of
temas
the
muy interesantes,
taxes,
por ejemplo,
for
en
example.
el Espinal, donde la
In
comunidad
Espinal,
está
in the
tan
community,
organizada que le
the
exige
community is so well organized
a sus gobernantes
that they
un rendimiento de
ask
cuentas
to their
y que el dinero que
authorities
llega como parte de la
transparency
aportación de
and
las
how they
empresas
use the
sea
money that
invertido en
the
infraestructura.
enterprises give.
En temas de participación,
In
la
terms of
gente
participation,
solicita y exige a
people
las
ask
empresas,
to
a
the
los
enterprises, to
proyectos,
the
que sean tomados en
projects,
cuenta, que les den
that
la
they be
oportunidad de
considered,
levantar la mano, de ser partícipes
to
de
be
los
part of
proyectos
the projects,
y de que su voz sea escuchada, ¿no? Lejos
and
de
want their
que
voice to be
solamente
heard.
Sean proyectos tangibles los que se puedan dar. Ellos
They
lo que
also want the
solicitan
projects to
es
be
que
real,
tengan derechos sobre sus
tangible,
propios recursos.
they feel they have the rights over their own resources.
En conclusión, podemos decir que
To conclude,
los
we can
proyectos
say that
deben
these
ser
projects,
vistos no
they
solo
must be
desde
seen
arriba
not
hacia
only
abajo,
from above
sino
to
deben ser vistos de manera unilateral. Pueden ser vistos también
could be,
desde abajo hacia
horizontal,
arriba, considerando la sensibilidad cultural y social de las
the
comunidades,
cultural aspects, tradition, customs of the communities,
considerar la transparencia en los recursos que
transparency
puedan
also, and the
servir como
resources
beneficio de las
that they
comunidades,
can be used for the well-being of communities,
en una distribución equitativa también de estos recursos que
in
de
a more
alguna manera se otorgan a
just
las
way of
comunidades, a
distribution
los
of
arrendatarios de
these
las tierras y a
for
los no
land.
beneficiados también por los proyectos.
okay, for authorities and people that use the land in their communities.
Gracias, esto es todo. Gracias, Arturo.
If anybody has a question, I can help you with the translation.
Gracias por la presentación. You may have to translate.
Thanks for the presentation.
En Oaxaca, los usos y costumbres
In
de las
Oaxaca,
comunidades,
traditions in the communities
customary law, ¿no? Es muy importante.
is very important.
No sé si podrían
So could you
explicar de
explain
qué manera la ley de uso del suelo a nivel estatal
the law of land use to the
determina
state
la
level,
posibilidad de este tipo de arrendamientos en tierras privadas, o si son comunales, o cuál es el papel de
what's the role of
los
the
usos y
law
costumbres a nivel
and
comunitario,
of the
cómo
traditional
encajan
and customs,
las diferentes
how do they harmonize,
niveles
how
de
do they
gobernanza
mix
a la hora
traditions and laws
de resolver estos conflictos, o incluso
when it is time to
de
solve the
antemano de
conflicts, for
permitir
example,
que este tipo de tierras se puedan usar para estos usos, ¿no?
before they give permission for these uses.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta. Definitivamente es un tema que tiene como distintas variantes, ¿no? Dependiendo de la comunidad donde se esté desarrollando el proyecto.
So thanks for the question. The answer would be it depends on the community. There's varieties according to the social context of every community.
Hasta el día de hoy, los usos y costumbres no han interferido en el tema normativo dentro de la legalidad. Sin embargo, es pues importante mencionar que las comunidades solicitan en muchas ocasiones ser partícipes también y sabedores de cuánto es lo que se percibe por el hecho de realizar un cambio de uso de suelo.
Yeah, up until now, there has not been a huge conflict between traditions and customs and the law, but the communities, they want to know like transparency according to the resources, the economical resources, because they don't know yet like how much investment and how much money for the land use changes.
Y en muchas de las ocasiones lo que sucede es que estas, como parte de esta solicitud de las comunidades, porque pueden ser privadas, pequeños propietarios en Oaxaca o ejidatarios, en muchas de las ocasiones, llevan estos temas a un acto de asamblea.
Okay, sometimes these topics are discussed in asamblea, which is this group discussions in the ejidos, because that's it.
Muchas gracias. Me interesaría saber sobre la temporalidad del proceso y desde cuánto antes de que las granjas eólicas se implanten, se empieza a trabajar con la comunidad o no, además de cuánto tiempo llevan trabajando con las comunidades. Gracias.
I would like to know how much time you've been working with the communities and in general like the process. Like how much time it has implied?
Okay. No existe un mecanismo fijo para todas las empresas. Cada quien decide cuánto tiempo antes interviene en las comunidades.
Every enterprise decides like how much time before they install the farm. They decide how much time before they're going to start with the process of communicating with the communities.
Sin embargo, lo que nos hemos podido percatar con estas entrevistas, investigaciones, es que por lo menos las empresas deciden llegar 2 años antes del inicio de las negociaciones para las tierras. Esto por la dificultad del acceso a ellas, ¿no?
Yeah, and what we have seen with the surveys and the research in general is that the enterprises arrive in the communities 2 years, like average, 2 years before they start with the negotiations, because that takes a lot of time.
Y con el tema de cuánto tiempo llevamos en esto, Arel y yo iniciamos juntos en este proceso comunitario y de atención a las comunidades. Llevamos 15 años trabajando con ellas.
About our work, Aurelia and I, we have been working for over 15 years with this process in this area, in these communities in the Istmo.
Muchas gracias por la presentación, súper bonita. Me intriga saber si pudieron detectar qué factores determinan que un proyecto sea exitoso y que la comunidad pueda sentirse apoderada de ese proyecto, y en cuáles comunidades no funciona y entonces tienen estos problemas sociales que se empiezan a crear hacia adentro de la sociedad. Si pueden identificar algunos factores en esas sociedades que sí funcionaron y en las otras que no.
Well, thanks for the presentation. I would like to know if you identify what factors or characteristics determine or they are essential for the success of a project or for the failure of a project, in which communities?
Definitivamente uno de los aspectos que es importante considerar es el nivel de información que tienen las comunidades. Es la forma en la que ellos participan, la forma en la que ellos se involucran. Desafortunadamente, cuando se llegaron las empresas eólicas a la región del Istmo, a las comunidades, no compartían información que para las comunidades era muy valioso conocer.
So the information sharing process is definitely the most important aspect. When they arrive and they actually are transparent with the communities, they appreciate that, the communities.
Entonces, definitivamente ese es el factor como clave, ¿no? La información
Information
y
is the
cómo
key.
se involucran, porque
How communities are involved.
Existe la percepción, el sentimiento de que las decisiones se toman,
Their
toman las
perception
empresas
is that enterprises make the decisions
y no las comunidades.
and not the communities.
Y en esta investigación
In this
justo
research,
pues quisimos que escuchar la voz
We
de
wanted
las
to hear the
comunidades
voice from the
y que
communities.
fuera como hacia arriba, ¿no?
We wanted to be like from down to up.
Everyone for your time, speakers and also audience here. Thank you. And also our amazing interpreter. Thank you.